Case 1. The Black Widow of Alamance. In the humid, sticky heat of an Alamance County summer, Burlington, North Carolina, feels like the kind of place where time slows down. It is a community built on faith, Sunday potlucks, and the unspoken rule that neighbors look out for one another. In the late 1982, if you drove down the tree-lined streets near the Carolina Christian Church, you might have seen a woman who embodied the very spirit of this Southern hospitality, Blanche Taylor Moore. To the outside world, she was perfection, a devout woman with meticulously coiffed hair, a grandmother who baked cakes for the sick, and a partner who stood stoically by the bedside of the men she loved as they withered away. But beneath the veneer of the sweet, church-going Southern belle lay a heart composed of pure, crystallized malice. Blanche wasn't nursing these men back to health. She was the architect of their agony. She was a predator in Sunday best, a woman who treated human lives like disposable assets, and whose weapon of choice was as silent as it was excruciating. While the town prayed for miracles, Blanche Taylor Moore was busy playing God. The story of her final, fatal mistake begins in 1989. Blanche had recently married the Reverend Dwight Moore, a man respected and beloved by his congregation. They had barely returned from their honeymoon when the Reverend fell violently ill. It started with what looked like a stomach bug, nausea, vomiting, a general weakness that just wouldn't let up. But within days, the symptoms spiraled into a living nightmare. His hands and feet went numb. His nervous system began to shut down. He was rushed to the hospital, his body racked with pain so intense that even the weight of a bedsheet was agonizing. Doctors were baffled. They tested for everything from exotic viruses to Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune disorder. Through it all, there was Blanche, the devoted wife. She was there every single day, hovering over his bed, fluffing his pillows, and spoon-feeding him ice chips and pudding. The hospital staff marveled at her dedication. "She's a saint," they whispered in the hallways. "Look at how she cares for him." They didn't see the truth. They didn't see that every time she offered him food, every time she smoothed his hair, she was tightening the noose. The turning point came not from police intuition, but from a medical anomaly. Reverend Moore's condition was deteriorating so rapidly that death seemed inevitable. His toxicity levels were off the charts. But for what? A sharp-eyed toxicologist at the hospital decided to run a screen for heavy metals, a test rarely ordered unless there is a specific suspicion. When the results came back, the medical team went silent. The Reverend wasn't sick with a virus. He had arsenic levels in his system that were 100 times the lethal limit. He wasn't dying. He was being murdered. Police were notified immediately. The investigation that unraveled in the following weeks exposed a timeline of horror that stretched back decades. Detectives realized that Dwight Moore wasn't the first man in Blanche's life to suffer this mysterious, agonizing decline. He was just the first one to survive it. They turned their attention to Raymond Reed. Raymond had been Blanche's boyfriend for years before she met the Reverend. He was a sturdy, healthy man who, in 1986, began to suffer from the same bizarre symptoms: nausea, neuropathy, and organ failure. He died a slow, painful death in the hospital, with Blanche sitting right there beside him, reading him scripture and feeding him peanut butter milkshakes. At the time, his death was attributed to Guillain-Barré syndrome. Investigators obtained a warrant to exhume Raymond Reed's body. The autopsy was a revelation of cruelty. Even years after his death, his tissues were saturated with arsenic. The levels were so high that the medical examiner determined he had been poisoned over a long period, likely months. Blanche had been methodically dosing him with an arsenic-based ant killer, a common household product available at any hardware store. She had watched him writhe in agony, and when the doctors stabilized him, She dosed him again to knock him back down. But the trail of bodies didn't stop at Raymond. The police looked further back, to James Taylor, Blanche's first husband, who died in 1973. His symptoms? Identical. They exhumed him too. The results? Positive, for massive amounts of arsenic. Then, in a twist that shocked even the most hardened detectives, they looked at Blanche's own father, P.D. Kaiser, who had died in 1966. He, too, was exhumed. He, too, was full of arsenic. The Black Widow of Alamance had been operating in plain sight for nearly 20 years. Her motive? It was a twisted cocktail of financial gain and control. With Raymond Reed, she had feared he would leave her, so she killed him to claim his estate. With her father, it was a lifetime of resentment. With the Reverend, the motive was murkier, perhaps purely the thrill of power, the power to decide who lives and who dies, hidden behind the mask of a grieving widow. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Receipts were found. Witnesses placed her purchasing the specific brand of ant poison used to kill the men. But perhaps the most damning evidence was the testimony of the survivors. The hospital staff who recalled Blanche bringing food to the victims that no one else was allowed to touch. The special milkshakes, the healing soups. The trial of Blanche Taylor Moore was a spectacle. The nation watched as the grandmotherly figure took the stand, vehemently denying everything, weeping crocodile tears and clutching her Bible. But the jury saw through the performance. They saw the cold, calculated monster who had turned family dinners into execution rituals. They saw a woman who had betrayed the most sacred trust imaginable. The trust between a wife and husband, a child and parent. In 1990, the gavel fell with the weight of 4 shattered lives behind it. Blanche Taylor Moore was found guilty of the murder of Raymond Reed and the attempted murder of Reverend Dwight Moore. The jury didn't hesitate on the punishment. They recommended the ultimate penalty. The judge sentenced Blanche Taylor Moore to death. She was sent to the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, where she became the oldest woman on North Carolina's death row. For over 3 decades, she has sat in a cell, maintaining her innocence, while the world outside has moved on. The Reverend Dwight Moore, though he survived, was left with permanent, debilitating nerve damage. He lived the rest of his life in the shadow of her betrayal, a man whose body was broken by the woman he promised to cherish. Blanche Taylor Moore is a reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears pearls. Sometimes it sits in the front pew at church. And sometimes it's the hand that offers you a cool drink of water when you are dying of thirst. She will never walk free again. She will breathe her last breath behind concrete walls. A fitting end for a woman who stole the breath of so many others. Case 2. The Death Row Granny. Robeson County, North Carolina. It's a place where tobacco fields stretch out to meet the horizon, and the air hangs heavy with the scent of pine and curing leaves. In this rural stretch of the South, widows are the pillars of the community. They are the keepers of memory, the ones who sit in the front rows of revival tents, clutching worn Bibles and singing hymns with eyes closed tight. Velma Barfield fit the mold perfectly. At 46 years old, she was a woman worn down by life, a grandmother who seemingly dedicated her remaining years to caring for the sick and the elderly. She was the person you called when your aging parent needed a live-in nurse. She was quiet, she was pious, and she was always there when death came knocking. But in Velma's world, death didn't just knock. It was invited in, offered a seat at the kitchen table, and served alongside a glass of sweet tea. While the community saw a struggling widow trying to make ends meet, the walls of the houses she worked in hid a terrified, pill-popping addict who had turned murder into a financial strategy. Velma Barfield wasn't a caretaker. She was a reaper in an apron. The facade began to crack on a cold morning in February 1978. Stuart Taylor, a tobacco farmer and Velma's boyfriend, had taken ill after attending a Rex Humbard concert with her. It was a scene that had played out too many times around Velma. The symptoms were violent and humiliating: projectile vomiting, uncontrollable diarrhea, a burning sensation in the gut that felt like swallowing fire. Stuart was a strong man, accustomed to the hard labor of the fields, but within hours, he was reduced to a moaning, fetal wreck. Velma was there, of course. She drove him to the hospital, playing the role of the distraught lover. She held his hand as his organs shut down, one by one. When Stuart died, the doctors in Lumberton were ready to sign it off as natural causes, perhaps a virulent stomach flu or a heart condition. But there was a problem. A few days later, while Velma was already asking about Stuart's will, an anonymous tip came in. It was a whisper, a suspicion from a family member who remembered that this wasn't the first time someone close to Velma had died with these exact same screaming symptoms. The authorities halted the funeral. An autopsy was ordered. When the toxicology report came back from Chapel Hill, the results were undeniable. Stuart Taylor hadn't died of the flu. He had been murdered with a massive dose of arsenic. Detectives brought Velma in for questioning. At first, she played the confused, grieving widow. But Velma was a woman driven by a singular, consuming hunger, addiction. For years, she had been hooked on tranquilizers, Valium, Librium, anything to numb the edges of her reality. She needed money to feed the habit, and when she ran out of her own, she stole from the people she claimed to love. And when they got close to discovering the theft, she silenced them. Under pressure, the death row granny broke. She confessed to poisoning Stuart Taylor. She admitted she had spiked his beer and tea with rat poison because he had discovered she'd forged checks in his name to buy pills. But once the dam broke, the floodwaters of her crimes surged out. She didn't just kill Stuart. Police began digging up the past, literally. They exhumed the body of her own mother, Lillian Bullard, who had died in 1974. Velma had killed the woman who gave her birth, just to silence her complaints about money. They looked at John Henry Lee and Dolly Edwards, two elderly people Velma had been hired to care for. Both had died in agony in 1977. Both had been poisoned. Velma had essentially turned her caretaking jobs into execution chambers, killing her charges whenever she needed to cover up her theft of their social security checks. The details of the poisonings were gruesome. Arsenic is not a quick killer. It is a torturer. It shreds the stomach lining, causes nerve damage, and leads to a death defined by conscious suffering. Velma watched her mother, her boyfriend, and her patients endure this hell. She cleaned up their vomit, changed their sheets, and then went to the kitchen to stir more poison into their drinks. It was a level of cold-blooded intimacy that chilled the investigators to the bone. The trial in 1978 was a sensation. Velma Barfield was the first woman in the United States to be tried for capital murder since the reinstatement of the death penalty. The courtroom was packed. The defense tried to paint her as a victim of a tragic life, a woman abused and drug-addicted, driven to madness. But the prosecution pointed to the methodical nature of the killings. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a business transaction. Theft, poison, death, repeat. The jury returned a verdict of guilty. The sentence was death. For 6 years, Velma sat on death row at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. Her time there was almost as controversial as her crimes. She miraculously found God, becoming a devout born-again Christian. She ministered to other inmates, wrote letters, and even gained the support of the famous evangelist Billy Graham. A Save Velma campaign swept the nation, arguing that she was a changed woman, a redeemed soul who shouldn't be executed. But the families of Stuart Taylor, Lillian Bullard, John Henry Lee and Dolly Edwards were not swayed by her jailhouse conversion. They remembered the screams of their loved ones. They remembered the betrayal. They demanded the justice that the law promised. The courts agreed. Appeal after appeal was denied. On the 2nd of November 1984, the time for talking ran out. Velma Barfield ordered her last meal, a bag of cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. She was led to the execution chamber at Central Prison in Raleigh. She wore pink pajamas and a diaper, a final indignity for the woman who had once controlled the lives of so many. At 2 a.m., the executioner administered the lethal injection. Velma Barfield became the first woman executed in the United States in 22 years, and the first ever by lethal injection in North Carolina. As the drugs took hold, the death row granny slipped away, not in the agony she had inflicted on her victims, but in a quiet, chemically induced sleep. Her death marked a definitive end. There was no parole, no second chance, no freedom in old age. The state of North Carolina had spoken. The life of a killer, no matter how repentant, does not outweigh the lives of the innocents she slaughtered for a bottle of pills. She is gone, but the echo of her cruelty remains in the soil of Robeson County, a permanent stain on the history of the South. Case 3. The Sandy and Casey Horror. Salisbury, North Carolina. A quiet, historic town where the past is preserved in brick and mortar, and family reputations are guarded like gold. In the early 2000s, the Parsons family presented themselves as the ultimate picture of charitable Christian love. Casey Parsons and her husband Sandy were the couple who opened their hearts and their home. They didn't just raise their own biological children, they took in the unwanted, the forgotten. When they adopted a little girl named Erica from a troubled background in 2000, the community applauded. Casey was the matriarch of this blended brood, a woman who projected an image of selfless motherhood. She blogged, she posted photos, she collected the adoption subsidy checks. But the walls of the Parsons' home on Miller Chapel Road were not sheltering a sanctuary. They were hiding a dungeon. And Erica Parsons wasn't a daughter to Casey. She was a paycheck. She was a punching bag. She was a slave for over a decade, while the neighbors saw a smiling family loading into a van for church. A slow-motion atrocity was taking place behind closed doors. One of the most sadistic cases of child abuse in North Carolina history. The cracks in the facade didn't appear until the 30th of July 2013. That was the day Erica's older adoptive brother, Jamie, finally walked into a police station. He was trembling, carrying a secret that had been eating him alive. He told the officers that he hadn't seen his sister, Erica, in nearly 2 years. 2 years. When police arrived at the Parsons' home to ask where the now 5-year-old girl was, Casey Parsons didn't flinch. She looked the officers in the eye and spun a tale with the ease of a pathological liar. She claimed Erica had gone to live with her biological grandmother, a woman named Nan, in Asheville. She said Erica was happy, safe, and living her best life on a farm. It sounded plausible enough to stall for a moment. But there was one problem. Nan didn't exist. The woman was a phantom, a pure fabrication invented by Casey to explain away the empty space at the dinner table. The investigation that followed peeled back the layers of Casey Parsons' evil, revealing a life for Erica that was worse than a horror movie because it was real. Detectives learned that Erica was the scapegoat for every frustration in Casey's life. While the biological children were treated to toys and love, Erica was systematically dehumanized. Witnesses and family members began to talk. They described how Casey would bend Erica's fingers back until they broke, how she was forced to sleep in a closet that locked from the outside, how she was fed dog food while the family ate steak. Erica was often beaten for relieving herself in the closet because she wasn't allowed to leave to use the bathroom. She was a prisoner in her own home, a little girl who learned that crying only brought more pain. The search for Erica captivated the nation. Casey and Sandy went on national television, on the Dr. Phil show, shedding tears and proclaiming their innocence. Casey played the victim, complaining about how the police were harassing her. It was a masterclass in narcissism. But the forensic accountants were busy. They found that, long after Erica had gone to Nan's, Casey was still cashing the monthly adoption assistance checks. She was funding her lifestyle with the money meant for the child she had already discarded. The grim truth was finally unearthed in September 2016. Sandy Parsons, sitting in a federal prison on fraud charges, finally broke. He led investigators to a desolate plot of land in Chesterfield County, South Carolina. There, in a shallow grave near a lonely highway, they found the skeletal remains of Erica Parsons. The autopsy was a catalogue of torture. Her bones told the story that her voice could no longer tell. She had fractures in varying stages of healing, broken ribs, broken fingers, a broken arm. She had been beaten, starved, and neglected until her body simply gave out. The medical examiner determined she had died sometime in late 2011. Casey had lived for 5 years with the knowledge that her daughter was rotting in the dirt, all while she cashed the checks and smiled for the cameras. The courtroom showdown was the moment justice finally caught up with the monster. Casey Parsons was already serving time for the financial fraud, but in 2019, she faced the reckoning for murder. The prosecutors painted a picture of a woman devoid of a soul, a child torture expert who enjoyed the pain she inflicted. Casey, realizing the mountain of evidence against her and facing the death penalty, took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, but there would be no mercy in the sentencing. The judge sentenced Casey Parsons to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was stripped of her freedom, her reputation, and her name. Today, she sits in a maximum security cell, a graying, bitter woman who will never again see the outside of a prison fence. She will die in a cage, just as she forced Erica to live in one. Sandy Parsons, the coward who enabled the abuse and buried the body, was also sentenced to 33 to 43 years in prison. He will be an old man, if he survives at all, before he is eligible for release. But the silence Erica Parsons left behind is deafening. She was a girl who wanted nothing more than to be loved, and instead, she was fed to a wolf disguised as a mother. The only comfort is knowing that the monster who hurt her is now the one locked away, staring at the walls, with nothing but time to think about the little girl in the closet who deserved so much more. Case 4. The River Suffocation. The Edisto River is a dark, winding vein that cuts through the heart of the Deep South. Its waters are black and murky, hiding cypress knees and shifting sandbars. In Orangeburg, a place where the heat can make you do crazy things, the river is usually a spot for fishing or cooling off. But in the early morning hours of the 16th of August 2010, it became the stage for a tragedy so unnatural that it left the entire region gasping for air. Shaquan Dooley was 29 years old. To the outside observer, she was a struggling young mother living under the roof of her own mother, trying to raise 3 children in a cramped, high-pressure household. There were arguments. There was stress. But there is a canyon of difference between stress and what Shaquan Dooley did that Sunday night. The initial call to 911 sounded like a horrific accident. A frantic mother claimed she had run off the road. Her car had plunged into the dark waters of the Edisto River at the Shillings Bridge Road boat landing. She had managed to escape, she sobbed. But her 2 baby boys, 2-year-old Devian and 18-month-old Jarvan, were still strapped in their car seats, sinking into the black abyss. Emergency crews rushed to the scene. Divers plunged into the murky water, fighting the current to reach the submerged vehicle. They pulled the limp, waterlogged bodies of the 2 toddlers from the car. It was a heartbreaking scene. Hardened first responders wept. A mother had lost her babies in a freak accident. The community's heart broke for Shaquan, but as the sun came up and the adrenaline faded, the story started to disintegrate. Investigators at the scene noticed things that didn't add up. There were no skid marks on the road leading to the water. The angle of the entry was suspicious. It looked less like a swerve and more like a launch. And then there was Shaquan herself. Her grief seemed calibrated. She was dry in places she shouldn't be. Her story shifted. First, she said she fell asleep at the wheel. Then, she said she was cut off. The police brought her in for questioning, not as a suspect initially, but to get a clearer picture. But the pressure of the lie was too heavy. Under the glare of the interrogation room lights, the mask of the grieving victim slipped, revealing the face of a cold-blooded killer. Shaquan Dooley confessed. There was no accident. There was no crash. She told detectives that earlier that night, she had gotten into a fight with her mother about her parenting, about money, about her lack of a job. She felt trapped. She felt angry. So, she decided to remove the obstacles in her life. She didn't kill them at the river. She killed them in the safety of a motel room. Shaquan had driven her children to a motel, checked in, and then, with a terrifying calmness, she proceeded to sedate them. She started with the older one, Devine. She held her hand over his mouth and pinched his nose. He thrashed. He fought. He looked at his mother with terrified eyes, gasping for the breath she was stealing from him. But she didn't let go. She held on until the life left his body. Then, she turned to the baby, Javan, the 18-month-old. She did the same to him. She snuffed out his life, while his brother's cooling body lay just feet away. Once her children were dead, strapped into their car seats like dolls, she knew she had to cover it up. She drove to the boat, landing in the dead of night. She put the car in gear, rigged the controls, and watched as it rolled into the river, carrying the evidence of her monstrosity into the deep. She wanted the world to think it was a tragedy. She wanted sympathy. The autopsy confirmed the horror. The children didn't have water in their lungs. They hadn't drowned. They were dead long before the car hit the river. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Carolinas. The woman who had been pitied just hours before was now the most hated woman in the state. People couldn't comprehend the level of detachment required to kill your own children with your bare hands, one by one, and then stage a crime scene. In court, Shaquan's defense tried to argue mental illness, claiming she was depressed and overwhelmed. But the prosecution pointed to the calculated nature of the cover-up. The drive to the motel, the checkout, the drive to the river. These were the actions of a person thinking clearly about self-preservation. In 2012, Shaquan Dooley pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. She stood before a judge, weeping, claiming she was sorry. But the judge looked at the photos of 2 beautiful little boys who would never grow up, never go to school, never fall in love. He sentenced Shaquan Dooley to 35 years in prison. While it wasn't the death penalty, the sentence ensured that her youth, her middle age, and the best years of her life would be spent in a concrete box. She entered prison a young woman. If she ever leaves, she will be an old, broken relic of a forgotten crime. Devane and Javan are buried together. Their short lives were extinguished by the one person in the world who was supposed to protect them. Shaquan Dooley didn't just kill her children. She betrayed the very definition of motherhood. And for that, the silence of her cell is the only sound she deserves. Case 5. The Laundry Room Martyr. Charlotte, North Carolina. The Queen's City. A bustling banking hub filled with skyscrapers, leafy suburbs, and the promise of the New South. But on Braden Drive, in a nondescript house, a 4-year-old girl named Mahelich Young, known to her family as Jelly, was living in a world of silent terror. To the neighbors, Malika Bennett was just another mother. But inside that home, she was a tyrant who enforced discipline with a cruelty that defies comprehension. For months in 2020, little Jelly wasn't seen. Neighbors didn't hear her playing. Family members stopped seeing her at gatherings. When asked, Malika had a ready excuse. Jelly was with her father, or she was visiting relatives. It was the pandemic. People were isolated. It was easy to hide a missing child when the world was already in hiding. But the truth was buried quite literally right under their noses. The horror unraveled in May 2021. The facade crumbled not because of police work initially, but because of a grandmother's gut instinct. Malika's mother had a nagging feeling that something was wrong. She hadn't seen her granddaughter in too long. She finally pressed the issue, and the story she uncovered was so grotesque, she immediately called the Charlotte-Mecklenburg police. When detectives arrived at the house on Braden Drive, Malika Bennett was defensive, but the officers had a warrant. They went to the backyard. There, near the fence, the earth had been disturbed. Digging down, they found the decomposing remains of 4-year-old Mehelik Young. The autopsy and the subsequent investigation revealed a torture chamber disguised as a laundry room. The details that emerged in court were nauseating. In late summer of 2020, Malika had decided that Jelly needed to be punished for potty training accidents, a normal occurrence for a child her age. But Malika's version of a timeout was sadistic. She forced the 4-year-old to stand in the laundry room. Not for 10 minutes, not for an hour, for 3 days. Jelly was forced to stand upright, without sitting, sleeping, or leaving. When her little legs grew tired and she tried to sit, Malika beat her. When she soiled herself because she wasn't allowed to use the bathroom, she was beaten again. Malika's 3-year-old daughter later testified that she watched her mother slam Jelly into the wall over and over again. By the 3rd day, Jelly's body began to shut down. She was exhausted, dehydrated, and battered. She collapsed. She gasped for air. And then, she died. Malika didn't call 911. She didn't try to revive her daughter. She treated Jelly's body like trash. She washed the corpse, wrapped it in plastic bags, and shoved it into the trunk of her SUV. For days, she drove around Charlotte with her daughter's body in the back, running errands, living her life. Finally, she dug a hole in the backyard, dumped the body, and covered it up. For nearly 9 months, Malika Bennett lived in that house, walked past that spot in the yard, and lied to everyone who asked where Jelly was. The justice porn moment came in 2023. Malika Bennett stood in a Mecklenburg County courtroom, facing the consequences of her depravity. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder to avoid a life sentence, a plea that enraged the community. However, the judge was merciless in his remarks. He sentenced Malika Bennett to the maximum allowed under the plea, 25 to 31 years in prison. 1. She was handcuffed and led away, a woman who had traded her daughter's life for a few days of cruel control. She will spend the next 3 decades in a cell, where she will be told when to eat, when to sleep, and when to stand. A fitting irony for the woman who forced a toddler to stand until she died. Jelly is gone, but the image of that laundry room haunts the city of Charlotte. It is a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous place for a child is their own home, and the most dangerous person is the one they call mommy. Case 6. The Sleeping Husband Shooter. Durham, North Carolina, 1988. The research triangle is booming, drawing in young professionals with the promise of suburban bliss. In one of the manicured subdivisions, Russ and Barbara Stager seemed to be living the American dream. Russ was a popular baseball coach at Durham High School, a man with a booming laugh and a heart of gold. Barbara was his devoted second wife, a woman who sang in the church choir, kept an immaculate house, and managed the couple's finances with what seemed like military precision. But the Stager household was a house of cards, built on a foundation of lies, debt, and a darkness that Barbara kept hidden behind her perfect smile. Russ Stager was sleeping next to a woman who viewed him not as a partner, but as an obstacle to her spending habits. And on the morning of the 1st of February 1988, the American dream turned into a bloody nightmare. The 911 call came in just after 6 a.m. Barbara Stager's voice was frantic, breathless. She told the dispatcher that she and Russ had been in bed. She claimed that Russ liked to sleep with a loaded handgun under his pillow for protection. She said she had reached under the pillow to move the gun because it made her nervous, and bang, it went off. When police arrived, they found Russ Stager in bed, clinging to life with a massive gunshot wound to the back of his head. He died hours later at the hospital. Barbara played the grieving widow to perfection. She wept. She organized the funeral. She told everyone it was a tragic, freak accident. "I just touched it, and it went off," she sobbed. But the detectives weren't buying it. There were problems with the physics of her story. The gun was a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol. It had a safety mechanism. It required a significant amount of pressure to pull the trigger. It doesn't just go off because you brush against it. Furthermore, the angle of the bullet entered the back of Russ's head and traveled downward, consistent with someone standing over him and firing, not someone fumbling under a pillow while lying down. Then, the investigation took a chilling turn. Detectives dug into Barbara's past and discovered a detail that made the hair on their necks stand up. 10 years earlier, Barbara's first husband, Larry Ford, had also died from an accidental gunshot wound. In that case, Barbara claimed she was cleaning a gun when it went off. She had walked away with a massive life insurance payout. Lightning doesn't strike twice. Not like this. As police dug deeper into the Stager finances, the motive became crystal clear. Barbara was a compulsive spender. She had forged Russ's signature on bank documents, piled up massive credit card debt, and was siphoning money from his accounts. She was drowning, and Russ had recently begun to ask questions. But the final nail in Barbara's coffin came from Russ Stager himself, from beyond the grave. While searching the house, investigators found a cassette tape in Russ's belongings. It was a voice recording he had made shortly before his death. On the tape, a terrified Russ Stager spoke to the future. He detailed his discovery of the stolen money. He spoke about the accidental death of Barbara's first husband, and then he said the words that would seal her fate. "If anything happens to me, Barbara did it." It was a voice from the dead, pointing a finger directly at his killer. The trial was a sensation. The Black Widow of Durham was exposed. The prosecution argued that Barbara had staged the scene. She had waited until Russ was in a deep sleep, stood over him, and executed him to collect his life insurance and hide her financial crimes. She had done it before, and she thought she could get away with it again. The jury didn't buy the accident defense. In 1989, Barbara Stager was convicted of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to death. However, due to a technicality regarding the jury instructions, her death sentence was later overturned and commuted to life imprisonment. Barbara Stager remains incarcerated at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. She has been up for parole multiple times, and each time, she is denied. She is an elderly woman now, her beauty faded, her perfect wife persona long gone. She sits in prison knowing that she didn't just kill her husband, she was outsmarted by him. Russ Stager's last act was to ensure that the woman who murdered him would never enjoy the freedom she stole from him. She is a reminder that some people are black holes, consuming everything and everyone around them until there is nothing left but darkness. Case 7. The Wilkes County Double Killer, Wilkes County, North Carolina. Nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, it's a place known for moonshine history, stock car racing, and deep, isolated hollers where secrets can stay buried for a long time. It's rugged country, beautiful but unforgiving. In the winter of 2017, the crisp mountain air in the community of Roaring River carried a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the chill of a brutal, chaotic violence that would leave two families shattered and a community looking over its shoulder. Stacy Miller wasn't the type of mother you'd find at the PTA bake sale. At 44 years old, her life was a turbulent storm of bad associations and volatile relationships. But no one expected that storm to break into a double homicide. The horror came to light on the 14th of October 2017. Deputies from the Wilkes County Sheriff's Office were called to a residence on Lodging Lane. It was a welfare check that turned into a crime scene investigation. Inside the home, they found a scene of carnage that looked like something out of a slasher film. Two bodies were discovered. The first was 7-year-old Barry Dean Bushell. The second was 50-year-old Rebecca Wellborn. They hadn't just been killed, they had been executed. Both victims had been shot, their bodies left to be found by whoever happened to walk through the door next. The house was silent, save for the buzz of flies. The investigation was immediate and intense. In a tight-knit mountain community, people talk. And they started talking about Stacy Miller. She was an associate of the victims, a woman who moved in the same circles. But as detectives peeled back the layers, they found a motive rooted in the oldest sins: jealousy, anger, and a complete disregard for human life. This wasn't a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. This was a slaughter. The evidence suggested that Stacy Miller had come to that house armed and ready to end lives. She didn't just want to hurt them. She wanted them erased. The manhunt for Stacy Miller didn't last long, but the legal battle was a war. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. For years, the families of Barry and Rebecca waited for justice. They sat through hearings, delays, and the agonizing slow grind of the legal system, all while the woman who killed their loved ones sat in the Wilkes County Jail. In October 2022, 5 long years after the bodies were found, Stacy Miller finally stood trial. The prosecution laid out the case. Miller was the aggressor. She was the one who pulled the trigger. She was the one who left 2 people dead on the floor and walked away. The defense tried to poke holes, but the jury saw the truth. They saw a woman who had made a choice to become a double murderer. The verdict was swift. Guilty on all counts. The judge didn't mince words. For the murder of Barry Dean Bushell, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the murder of Rebecca Wellborn, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentences were to run consecutively. 2 life sentences. Stacy Miller was effectively told she would die in prison twice. As she was led out of the Wilkes County courthouse, the families of the victims finally exhaled. The Wilkes County double killer was no longer a threat. She was just another inmate number. Stacy Miller is now housed in the North Carolina State Prison System. She will wake up every morning in a cage, staring at concrete walls instead of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She took 2 lives, stealing decades of memories, laughter, and love. In return, the state has taken every remaining second of her existence. She is a ghost in the system. A woman whose name is now synonymous with the evil that can hide in the quietest of hills. Case 8. The Raleigh Kidnapper. Raleigh, North Carolina, the heart of the state. It's a city of government buildings, universities, and quiet, established neighborhoods where the oaks are as old as the history books. In 1998, 86-year-old Alice Marie Parker was living the life she had earned. She was a widow, independent, feisty, and loved by her community. She lived alone in her home, a place that should have been her fortress. But in the spring of that year, her fortress was breached not by a stranger kicking down the door, but by a woman who smiled in her face and called herself a friend. Carlette Parker, no relation to Alice, was a 3-4-year-old woman with a heart full of greed and a soul devoid of empathy. She had wormed her way into Alice's life, helping her with chores, running errands, gaining the trust of an elderly woman who just wanted a little companionship. But Carlette wasn't looking for friendship. She was looking for a payday, and she decided that Alice's life was worth less than the balance of her checking account. The nightmare began on the 12th of May, 1998. Alice disappeared. She vanished from her home without a trace. Her family was frantic. This wasn't a woman who wandered off. This was a woman who had her routines. Police launched a massive search, combing the woods and the neighborhoods of Wake County. While the community searched, Carlette Parker was busy. She wasn't worried. In fact, she was shopping. Detectives quickly zeroed in on Carlette. They found that in the days following Alice's disappearance, checks from Alice's account were being cashed. Who was cashing them? Carlette Parker. She was caught on surveillance cameras, bold as brass, stealing from the woman who was missing. When police brought her in, Carlette spun a web of lies. She claimed Alice had gone on a trip. She claimed Alice had given her the money. But under intense interrogation, the story fell apart. The truth was far more sinister than simple theft. Carlette confessed that she had kidnapped the 86-year-old woman. She had forced Alice into her car and driven her out to a secluded, wooded area in rural Wake County. Alice, terrified and confused, likely pleaded for her life. She probably offered Carlette whatever money she wanted. But Carlette didn't just want the money. She wanted to eliminate the witness. She drove Alice to a lonely dirt road. She forced the elderly woman out of the car. And there, amidst the pine trees, Carlette Parker shot Alice Marie Parker in the back of the head. She executed an 86-year-old grandmother like a mob hitman. Then, she left her body in the woods to rot and went to the bank to cash a check. The discovery of Alice's body devastated the city. It was a crime of such profound cowardice, preying on the most vulnerable member of society, that it made the blood of seasoned detectives run cold. The trial in 1999 was emotional. The prosecution painted Carlette as a predator who hunted the elderly. They showed the jury the bank records, the gun, and the photos of Alice's body dumped like garbage. Carlette tried to claim it was an accident, or that she was coerced. But the jury saw the calculation in her eyes. The verdict was guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. But the jury wasn't done. When it came time for sentencing, they looked at the aggravating factors: the victim's age, the kidnapping, the financial motive, the betrayal of trust. They decided that prison wasn't enough. The judge sentenced Carlette Parker to death. She was sent to death row, joining the infamous ranks of Blanche Taylor Moore. For over 2 decades, Carlette Parker has sat in a cell, appealing her sentence, fighting for a life she didn't hesitate to take from Alice. Alice Marie Parker was a woman who had lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and the changing of the century, only to be taken out by a greedy predator in her own backyard. Carlette Parker's legacy is one of shame. She is a reminder that the wolves don't always howl. Sometimes they knock on the front door and offer to help carry the groceries. Case 9. The Chemist Poisoner. Raleigh, North Carolina. The Research Triangle Park is one of the smartest places on Earth, a hub of innovation where PhDs and scientists flock to solve the world's problems. In the year 2000, Eric and Ann Miller were the golden couple of this intellectual elite. Eric was a brilliant pediatric AIDS researcher, a man dedicating his life to saving sick children. Ann was a research chemist, sharp, ambitious, and equally talented. They had a beautiful home, a young child, and a future that looked blindingly bright. But chemistry is a dangerous science. In the hands of a healer, it saves lives. In the hands of Ann Miller, it became a weapon of mass destruction aimed at the one man who loved her most. Anne didn't just want a divorce, she wanted a deletion. And she used her knowledge of the periodic table to orchestrate one of the most calculated, cold-blooded murders in North Carolina history. The slow-motion assassination of Eric Miller began in November 2000. It started innocuously enough. Eric went bowling with some colleagues. During the game, he took a sip of beer that he said tasted off, bitter, strange. Within hours, he was violently ill. He was rushed to the hospital with symptoms that looked like a severe viral infection: vomiting, burning pain, weakness. For weeks, Eric fought for his life. He was in agony. His organs were failing. And just like the other black widows before her, Anne was right there by his side. She played the doting wife, holding his hand, speaking to the doctors, managing his care. But behind the tears, she was watching her experiment unfold. She had access to his IVs. She had access to his food. And she had the knowledge to know exactly what was happening to him. Eric Miller died on December 2, 2000. He was only 30 years old. The medical examiner initially thought it might have been a rare disease, but samples sent to the lab told a different story. Eric was filled with arsenic. The levels were astronomical. This was a man who had been poisoned not once, but likely multiple times. The investigation immediately turned to Anne. As a chemist, she had access to arsenic. She knew how to handle it. But the case took a bizarre and scandalous turn when police discovered the why. Anne was having an affair. Her lover was a man named Daryl Willard, a co-worker of Eric's. Police brought Daryl in for questioning. He was rattled. He lawyered up, but the pressure was too much. In a shocking twist, just weeks after the investigation heated up, Daryl Willard committed suicide. He was found dead in his garage. It seemed like the case might die with him. But Daryl left something behind. A briefcase. And inside that briefcase, and in statements he made to his attorney before he died, was the truth. He hadn't just been an observer. He had been a pawn. Anne had manipulated him. She had given him the arsenic-laced beer to give to Eric at the bowling alley. She had used him to deliver the poison so she could keep her hands clean. Despite this, the case against Anne was circumstantial and complex. It took years of forensic accounting and legal battles to tighten the net. Anne moved on. She remarried. She tried to live a normal life, thinking she had outsmarted the system. She thought that because the delivery man was dead, she was safe. But justice has a long memory. In 2004, armed with new forensic evidence and the statements from the dead lover's estate, prosecutors indicted Anne Miller Contz for first-degree murder. The trial was set to be the showdown of the century in Raleigh. The chemist killer versus the state. But Anne, realizing the science was against her, folded. In 2005, she entered a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. The judge sentenced Anne Miller Contz to 25 to 31 years in prison. While it wasn't a death sentence, it was a life destroyed. The woman who had it all, the career, the family, the intellect, was stripped of her lab coat and put in a prison uniform. She missed her child growing up. She missed the prime of her life. She entered prison, a young, vibrant woman, and spent the next 2 decades watching the world change without her. Eric Miller's legacy lives on in the research he started, in the lives he saved. Anne's legacy is a cautionary tale about the toxicity of greed. She thought she could use science to commit the perfect crime, but she forgot the most basic law of nature. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and the reaction to her evil was the crushing weight of justice. Case 10. The Zara Baker Betrayal, Hickory, North Carolina, October 2010. The foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains are usually a tapestry of burning red and orange leaves this time of year, a scenic backdrop for a quiet, hard-working town known for furniture manufacturing and deep-rooted family values. It is a place where neighbors know the cars in each other's driveways. But in the autumn of 2010, the crisp air of Hickory became choked with a suffocating collective grief. The town didn't just witness a crime, they witnessed the total disintegration of humanity. They looked into the face of a monster, and what stared back was a woman named Zara Baker. To understand the magnitude of the evil that visited Hickory, you first have to understand the angel it destroyed. Zara Baker was 10 years old. She had a smile that could light up a stadium, a beaming, gap-toothed grin that she flashed constantly, despite a life that had been a relentless series of battles. Born in Australia, Zara had fought bone cancer since she was a toddler. She had lost her lower left leg to the disease. She wore a prosthetic limb. She had lost her hearing in one ear. Her lungs were scarred from chemotherapy. By all medical logic, she should have been bitter or broken. Instead, she was sunshine personified. People who met her described her as possessing a spirit that refused to be crushed. She had defeated cancer. She had beaten the odds. She was a survivor. But Zara Baker could not survive her stepmother. Zara Baker was a black hole of chaotic energy. She was a woman who lived her life in the murky corners of the internet, constructing elaborate, gothic fantasies to mask a pathetic reality. She met Zara's father, Adam Baker, online. Adam was an Australian. Elisa was a local North Carolinian. They bonded over a shared, bizarre subculture of simulated vampires and gothic roleplay. It sounds ridiculous, perhaps even trivial, but this disconnect from reality was the breeding ground for the violence to come. When Adam moved to North Carolina with Zara to marry Elisa, he thought he was building a family. In reality, he was delivering his disabled daughter into the hands of her executioner. The nightmare officially began on the morning of the 9th of October 2010. At 5:30 a.m., a frantic call came into the Hickory Police Department. It was Adam Baker. His voice was trembling, confused. He told the dispatcher that he had woken up to find a ransom note on the windshield of his car. He said his daughter, Zara, was gone. "There's a note on my car," he stammered. "It says, 'Mr. Baker, we have your daughter. If you want to see her again, do not call the police. We will be in touch.'" It was the kind of scenario you see in movies. A kidnapping, a ransom note, a frantic father. Police swarmed the house on 21st Avenue Northwest. They treated it as an active abduction. Amber alerts were issued. Search dogs were deployed. The community of Hickory mobilized instantly. Hundreds of volunteers, touched by the photos of the smiling girl with the prosthetic leg, scoured the woods, the parks, and the roadsides. They tied yellow ribbons around trees. They held candlelight vigils. They prayed for Zara's safe return. But inside the house, the detectives were already sensing the rot. The ransom note was wrong. It was scrawled, barely literate, and asked for $1 million, a sum that Adam Baker, a man working meager jobs, clearly did not have. It demanded the money be delivered to the man in the black mask. It read like a child's idea of a crime, or worse, a narcissist's idea of a screenplay. And then there was Elisa. From the moment police arrived, Elisa Baker's behavior was erratic. She wasn't the grieving stepmother. She was the center of attention. She spun wild stories about unseen enemies, people who hated Adam, mysterious figures stalking the family. But her history was catching up with her. Police quickly discovered that Elisa was a career con artist. She had a rap sheet of petty crimes, bad checks, and fraud. She lived in a world of fabrication. The timeline started to fracture. Police asked the neighbors, "When did you last see Zara?" The answers were chilling. No one had seen the little girl in weeks. Not days. Weeks. She hadn't been to school. She hadn't been seen playing in the yard. The abduction on October 9th was a phantom event. Zara hadn't been taken that morning. She had been gone for a long, long time. The investigation pivoted from a search and rescue to a homicide inquiry. They zeroed in on Elisa. They brought her into the interrogation room, a small, windowless box where her lies would finally run out of oxygen. For days, Elisa played a cat-and-mouse game. She blamed Adam. She blamed strangers. She blamed a Mexican cartel. She spun tales so absurd they would have been laughable if the stakes weren't a child's life. But the detectives were relentless. They picked apart her stories, one by one. They found the cell phone records. They found the ping data that showed Elisa driving to remote, desolate areas in the middle of the night, weeks prior. Finally, the dam broke. But it didn't break with a confession of remorse. It broke with a transaction. Elisa Baker, realizing she was cornered, tried to deal. She offered to lead them to the body parts. Yes, parts in exchange for concessions. The following days were a descent into hell for the search crews. Guided by the monster herself, they went to multiple sites across Caldwell and Catawba counties. This wasn't a recovery. It was a harvest of horrors. On Christie Road, in a tangle of kudzu and briars, they found a prosthetic leg. Zara's leg. It was the only part of her that was artificial, yet finding it was a punch to the gut of the entire state. It was the symbol of her survival, now discarded like trash in the woods. But it got worse. Much worse. Elisa had not just killed Zara, she had butchered her. The details that emerged were so graphic, they traumatized the seasoned forensics team. Investigators determined that Zara had died on the 24th of September 2010, 2 weeks before the fake kidnapping call. The cause of death? A pattern of systematic abuse and neglect that culminated in murder. Elisa had grown to hate the child. She resented the attention Zara needed. She resented her disability. Witnesses later testified that Elisa would punish the girl by taking away her prosthetic leg, leaving her unable to walk, forced to crawl around the house. She would withhold food. She would beat her. On that final day, something happened in that house. Elisa claimed Zara had died of illness or a fall, and that she panicked. But you don't dismember a child because you panicked. You do it because you are trying to erase them. Elisa had taken the body of this 10-year-old cancer survivor into the bathroom. Using tools from the garage, she had dismantled the child. She cut her into pieces to make her fit into bags. She then loaded those bags into the back of a sedan and drove around the county, tossing them out the window like fast food wrappers. They found her spine. They found her skull. They never found all of her. The community's grief turned to a white-hot, volcanic rage. The Justice for Zara movement wasn't just a slogan. It was a demand for blood. People lined the streets outside the courthouse, screaming for Elisa. They wanted to tear her apart, just as she had done to that little girl. In 2011, Elisa Baker stood before a judge. She had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, obstructing justice, and bigamy, another layer of her fraudulent life. The plea deal saved her from the death penalty, a fact that enraged the public. But the prosecutors explained that without her cooperation, they might never have found Zara's remains to give her a burial. They made a deal with the devil to get the angel back. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with hatred. The judge, clearly struggling to maintain judicial composure in the face of such atrocity, threw the book at her. For the murder of Zara Baker, Elisa was sentenced to 15 to 18 years in state prison. But the system wasn't done. The federal government stepped in. They slapped her with charges related to drug conspiracy. Elisa had been distributing pills, oxycodone and hydrocodone, the same pills she likely used to numb herself while she lived in a house with a dead child. The federal judge added another 10 years to her sentence. Elisa Baker, now in her late 52s, is currently incarcerated at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. Her release date is projected for 2030 or beyond, at which point she will be an elderly woman. But her sentence is not just measured in years, it is measured in the absolute isolation of her existence. In prison, crimes against children are the bottom of the hierarchy. Zara Baker is a pariah even among murderers. She lives in protective custody, separated from the general population, because the other inmates know what she did. They know she took the leg of a crippled girl. They know she scattered a child's bones in the woods. Zara Baker's funeral was attended by hundreds of strangers who wept for a girl they never knew. Her casket was white, covered in flowers. She was finally put to rest, whole in spirit, if not in body. Zara Baker remains in her cage. She is a woman who tried to write her own reality, where she was the victim and the hero. But in the end, the only title she earned, and the only one she will ever carry, is that of the most hated woman in North Carolina history. She breathes, she eats, she sleeps, but she will never truly live again. She is a ghost haunting a cell, while the memory of Zara's smile shines brighter than Elisa's darkness ever could. Case 11. The Duke Accuser's Final Act. Durham, North Carolina. This city is often defined by its universities and its history, but in 2006, it was defined by a single name, Crystal Mangum. She was the woman at the center of the Duke lacrosse scandal, a media firestorm that tore the country apart. For years, she was painted as a victim by some and a liar by others. The world thought they knew everything there was to know about her. But the cameras eventually packed up. The reporters went home, and Crystal Mangum was left in the shadows of Durham, where her story didn't end, it festered. While the world argued about her past, Crystal was busy destroying her future. And in 2011, the woman who had once accused others of violence became the ultimate aggressor. This time, the victim wasn't a wealthy athlete. It was Reginald Dye, a 6-year-old man who made the fatal mistake of loving a woman who thrived on chaos. Reginald was a hard-working man, described by friends as gentle and generous. He had taken Crystal in when she was struggling. He tried to help her with her demons. But in the apartment they shared on Roseland Avenue, the atmosphere was toxic. Neighbors reported constant fighting, screaming matches that spilled out into the parking lot. The explosion happened on the 3rd of April 2011. It was a Sunday evening. Police responded to a domestic disturbance call at the apartment. When they arrived, they found a scene of confusion. Reginald Day was wounded, clutching his side. At first, it didn't look life-threatening. He was conscious. He was talking. He told the officers that he and Crystal had been arguing about money and bills. He said she had started throwing things, clothes, a TV. But then, the argument turned deadly. Reginald told police that Crystal had grabbed a kitchen knife. She didn't just threaten him. She plunged it into his torso. Crystal was arrested on the spot, charged with assault with a deadly weapon. She was her usual defiant self, claiming self-defense, claiming he attacked her. It was a narrative the Durham police had heard before, but this time the evidence was etched in blood. The situation took a tragic turn 10 days later. Reginald Day, who was recovering in the hospital, suddenly took a turn for the worse. The knife wound had done more damage than the doctors initially realized. Complications set in. His organs began to fail. On the 13th of April 2011, Reginald Dye died. The charge against Crystal Mangum was upgraded immediately. First-degree murder. The trial in 2013 was a surreal spectacle. The woman who had once captivated the national media was now standing trial for a brutal stabbing. Her defense team tried to paint a picture of a battered woman fighting for her life. They brought up her past trauma. They tried to use her history as a shield. But the prosecution had something stronger. Reginald's own words. Before he died, Reginald had given a statement. He described the attack clearly. He described a woman in a rage, not a woman in fear. He described how she had come at him with the intent to kill. The jury deliberated. The celebrity of the defendant didn't matter. The politics of 2006 didn't matter. All that mattered was the man who was dead, because Crystal Mangum couldn't control her temper. The verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced Crystal Mangum to 14 to 18 years in prison. She was led away in handcuffs, still protesting, still fighting, still playing the victim. She is currently incarcerated at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. The woman who once held the attention of the entire world now holds nothing but a mop in a prison hallway. Reginald Day is gone. A footnote in the life of a woman who left destruction in her wake wherever she went. His death was the final, tragic proof that the most dangerous thing in Durham wasn't a sports team, it was Crystal Mangum.